Have you ever seen an old family photo where a child's gaze won't let you go? In this portrait taken in Chicago in 1904, an 8-year-old boy stares straight into the camera with a cold calm, a look so old, so knowing so much of something the family tries to hide. His name is Thomas Whitfield, the son of a wealthy industrialist who was building a machinery empire for the booming city. Just months before the photo was taken, a horrific explosion killed 3 workers in a family-owned factory. But old news reports, lost letters, and a child's testimony reveal an even darker story. Secrets about power money and a truth that adults themselves want buried. Tonight, join us as we slowly follow each clue from the boy's eyes in the photograph to forgotten records to discover what the Whitfield family has tried to keep hidden for more than a century. In the soft, hesitant spring of 2024, antique photograph appraiser David Harrison received a call that would stay with him long after he hung up. The voice on the line belonged to Dr. Rebecca Matthews, curator of the Chicago History Museum. Her words carried both excitement and an uneasy weight. The museum had recently acquired a sizable collection of early 20th century photographs from the estate of a prominent Illinois family. Among the carefully catalogued images, several had begun to whisper questions that no one on her staff could quite answer. We have a 1904 family portrait that's been troubling our research team, Dr. Matthews confided. At first glance, she explained it looked like a perfectly ordinary formal photograph from that elegant era. And yet, there was something about one of the children that refused to sit quietly within the frame. Harrison, whose career had been built on untangling photographic puzzles and the subtle truths hidden inside antique images, felt an instant pull. 25 years of studying vintage photographs had taught him that the smallest details could unfold entire histories of love, deception, or quiet tragedy. A few days later, he stepped into the grand building of the Chicago History Museum on North Clark Street. Dr. Matthews met him in the museum's private research facility where the newly acquired collection rested under careful light. Tables were spread with photographs, brittle documents, and personal effects fragments of the Whitfield family, one of Chicago's industrial dynasties at the turn of the century. The Whitfield collection spans from the 1890s through the 1920s, Dr. Matthews explained, leading him to a single photograph waiting on an examination table. Most of these are straightforward portraits and cheerful gatherings. But this one keeps all of us awake. Before them lay an 8x10 studio portrait mounted on thick cardboard, as was the fashion of 1904. The image had the crispness of a premier Chicago photography studio, every shadow and highlight balanced to perfection. At first it seemed utterly proper, a well-dressed family of 4 posed in elegant symmetry, a frozen emblem of status and comfort. The Whitfields appeared exactly as history might expect them. Charles Whitfield, a man in his early 40s with the polished authority of a successful businessman, stood behind his seated wife. His dark suit was immaculately tailored, a silk vest, and a glinting gold watch chain catching the studio lights. His posture radiated confidence, his expression set in the solemn dignity that formal portraits demanded. Beside him, Mrs. Catherine Whitfield sat gracefully in an ornate chair. Her gown shimmered with intricate beadwork and lace, each stitch speaking of wealth and refined taste. Her hair rose in the fashionable Gibson girl style, and a string of delicate jewelry hinted at fortunes quietly secured. Their children completed the tableau. 12-year-old Margaret stood beside her mother, her sailor-collared dress, the height of young society fashion. 8-year-old Thomas perched on a small stool near his father's feet, clad in a boy's formal suit with neat knee breeches and high stockings. Behind them, a painted backdrop of marble columns and imagined gardens gave the impression of timeless refinement. The lighting was flawless soft, even betraying the practiced hand of a master photographer. Harrison's trained eyes traced every detail: the clothing, the jewelry, the carefully chosen props. All of it felt authentic, anchored firmly in 1904. And yet, as Dr. Matthews had warned, something about young Thomas resisted the comfort of explanation. It was only when Harrison leaned closer, letting the quiet of the room settle around him, that the faint unease began to take shape. The boy's face, though unmistakably that of a child, carried an expression that made Harrison's breath slow. There was something disquietingly mature about young Thomas Whitfield, an awareness far older than 8 years, an understanding that simply did not belong in a child's portrait from 1904. Leaning closer, Harrison adjusted the magnifying lens over the boy's small features. What came into focus unsettled him immediately. The eyes were the first betrayal. Instead of the soft curiosity or stiff solemnity common in children of that era, Thomas's gaze held a cold, measured calculation. It was the look of someone weighing secrets of a mind already sharpened by experience no child should have known. And then there was the mouth, a slight, almost imperceptible curve of a smile. Not playful, not shy, but a faint, knowing curl, as though the boy carried some private satisfaction. A secret that neither his parents nor sister seated so close were meant to understand. Dr. Matthews stepped beside Harrison, her voice low, as though speaking too loudly might wake something inside the photograph. "Look at his posture," she murmured. "Compare him to Margaret." Harrison followed her observation. Margaret, 12 and restless, displayed the natural unease of a child forced to hold still during a long studio exposure, a hint of fidgeting. The quick brightness in her eyes, a smile both eager and strained. Thomas, by contrast, sat with perfect composure. No restless hands, no nervous twitch of the eyes. He seemed entirely at ease before the camera, as if he had posed countless times, or as if the idea of being observed no longer meant anything to him at all. The more Harrison studied, the more troubling the differences became. Margaret's expression revealed effort, an attempt to please the adults who required her patience. Thomas gave nothing of the sort. His stillness was complete, almost practiced, as though he had been trained in a discipline far beyond his years. But it was his eyes that lingered in Harrison's thoughts. They did not focus directly on the camera. Instead, they seemed to settle just beyond it, fixed on some point invisible to everyone else in the studio that day. Combined with that faint secret smile, the effect was unnerving. It was as if Thomas were silently acknowledging someone or something outside the frame, someone his family could not see. Harrison knew that to understand the boy's unsettling presence, he would have to look beyond the photograph itself. The story behind the Whitfields and whatever had shaped this child would be hidden in the family's records. The museum's acquisition files offered a beginning. The entire Whitfield collection had been donated by Eleanor Whitfield Carson, great-granddaughter of Charles and Catherine Whitfield. According to her statement, the photographs had slept for decades in the attic of the family's Lake Forest estate, only to be discovered when she settled her grandmother's affairs. Eleanor's accompanying letter carried its own quiet warning. Her family, she wrote, had always been strangely guarded about their early years in Chicago, especially the first decade of the 1900s. Her grandmother, Margaret, the very girl in the photograph, rarely spoke of her childhood at all. When old pictures surfaced, she would grow silent, her discomfort unmistakable. Harrison reached out to Eleanor for more. During a carefully measured phone conversation, she shared what little had been passed down through the generations' fragmented stories that were never fully explained. My grandmother Margaret used to say that something terrible happened to her brother Thomas when they were children, Eleanor revealed softly. She never gave details, but she always insisted that Thomas had been changed by something very young. After 1904, she said he was never the same, and the adults, well, they began treating him differently, almost as if they were afraid of him. Her words lingered long after the call ended, leaving Harrison staring once more at the boy's calm, impossible eyes. What experience could hollow out childhood so completely and leave a trace strong enough to haunt a photograph more than a century later? In the end, the Whitfields chose a quiet solution. When Thomas was only 10 years old, the family sent him away to a private boarding school, an abrupt decision that hinted at a home unsettled by more than mere education. To Harrison, this revelation suggested that the 1904 portrait might not have been a simple family keepsake at all. It felt more like a marker, a photograph taken on the very edge of something breaking a frozen record of a transition. The adults could neither stop nor fully explain. If he wished to understand what had scarred young Thomas, Harrison knew he had to step back into the noise of 1904 Chicago, into the world beyond the carefully lit studio. For days he buried himself in the Chicago Public Library's archives, turning brittle pages and scrolling faded microfilm, chasing any mention of the Whitfield name. The trail soon led to the city's restless heart industry. Charles Whitfield, as the newspapers described him, was not merely a businessman, but a builder of Chicago's future. He owned several manufacturing plants that fed the city's expanding infrastructure. But prosperity had its shadows. Articles from the Chicago Tribune early that year reported fierce labor disputes at Whitfield factories, stories of unsafe conditions, injured workers, and whispered accusation of profit placed above human lives. Charles emerged from these columns as a man both celebrated and condemned, a figure whose ambition left little room for mercy. Then Harrison found something far more chilling. A series of pieces from the Chicago Daily News, published during the summer of 1904, told of a criminal investigation that reached directly into the Whitfield home. The headlines alone carried a shiver. Prominent family under investigation. Child witness in industrial accident case. Young boy's testimony raises questions. According to these reports, 8-year-old Thomas had been present during a catastrophic accident at one of his father's factories, an accident that killed 3 men and injured several more. The boy had apparently witnessed details that contradicted his father's official account, placing the family in a dangerous spotlight. One August article struck Harrison hardest. It claimed that Thomas, barely 8 years old, had given investigators a testimony both precise and damning. The child described overhearing safety warnings that his father had dismissed. His words implied that Charles Whitfield had known of the risk, yet refused costly precautions that might have prevented the tragedy. What unsettled investigators most was not only the accusation but the sophistication of the account. Thomas spoke with an adult's grasp of industrial machinery and safety protocols, explaining technical processes with unnerving clarity. How could a child so young understand the machinery of both steel and politics? Yet the last article, printed in September 1904, carried a strangely quiet conclusion. The case was closed without charges. Political pressure, it suggested, had smothered the investigation. Wealth and influence had sealed the Whitfield name behind closed doors. Harrison felt the cold outline of a tragedy taking shape. Court records from the Cook County archives filled in the harrowing details. On July 12, 1904, a steam boiler exploded inside the South Side facility of Whitfield Manufacturing. The blast tore through the factory floor, killing 3 workers instantly and leaving 5 more with devastating burns and crushing injuries. Witnesses described an explosion so violent it ripped away an entire section of the building. Thomas had been there that day. The boy, brought along by his father to learn the business, stood in an office that overlooked the factory floor when the boiler erupted. But it was not just the horror he witnessed, it was what he heard. His testimony recounted private conversations between his father and the factory supervisor only hours before the disaster. Words exchanged in a quiet office. Warnings dismissed, decisions weighed and chosen. Imagine. Harrison thought the small figure of a boy, listening from the corner of a polished office, his eyes already carrying that strange, too knowing calm. What does a child become after overhearing the calculus of life and profit and watching the cost explode before his very eyes? The court transcripts revealed the part of the story no photograph could capture. 8-year-old Thomas had testified that on the day of the accident, he overheard the factory supervisor pleading with his father to shut down the boilers. The pressure readings were dangerous, the man warned. Repairs were needed. Charles Whitfield, Thomas said, refused. Deadlines, he insisted, were more important than caution. The boy recalled his father dismissing the warnings as nothing more than excuses from men who wished to slow the pace of production. What followed was even more chilling. Thomas described with the clarity of someone far older his father's reaction when the explosion finally came. Instead of shock or sorrow, Charles had immediately turned to strategy, speaking of legal liability, calculating the cost of compensation, even discussing how to shield the family name while the injured were still being carried from the wreckage. It was a response so cold that investigators questioned whether a child could truly have witnessed and understood such moments. Further examination of the court records explained the unsettling maturity of the testimony. For months before the disaster, Charles had been bringing his young son into the heart of the factory, ostensibly to teach him the family business. Thomas had sat quietly in offices and walked the echoing floors, listening as adults debated production schedules and safety complaints. He had watched his father brush aside injury reports, had heard the careful arithmetic of profit versus protection. The boy's recollection of these discussions was astonishingly precise. He spoke of overheard conversations in which Charles weighed the cost of new safety equipment against the cheaper option of paying compensation to injured workers. He even described meetings where his father and business associates outlined legal maneuvers to avoid responsibility should another accident occur. What troubled investigators most was not just the detail, but the comprehension. Thomas seemed to understand the machinery of power itself, the quiet calculus by which wealth bends laws and reshapes consequences. And then there was the matter of coaching. Records showed that Charles had tried to prepare his son, instructing him on what to say if questioned about the factory's conditions. Yet when the moment came, Thomas defied his father. Instead of repeating the approved story, he told the truth, every damning word of it. For an 8-year-old, it was an act of astonishing independence, a choice that demanded moral courage few adults possess. But such courage carries a cost. Harrison's research uncovered the family's private correspondence, and with it, the hidden aftermath. Charles Whitfield's letters to his wife dripped with anger and disbelief. He called his son a traitor, convinced that outside agitators had poisoned the boy's mind against him. He wrote not of guilt for the dead, but of betrayal of reputations endangered and fortunes threatened. Catherine Whitfield's diary entries penned late in 1904 revealed a quieter but equally telling response. Her words trembled with worry, but not for Thomas's